let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to everyone that's able to make it on this special edition of a Mornings on Main webinar. My name is Ben White. I'm the Senior Program Specialist from Missouri Main Street Connection, and I am joined by my coworker, Katelyn Brotherton. The title of this webinar is How to Strategize for Grants, and so that is one of Katelyn's duties. At our staff. She works on that for us and for other organizations. And so she's going to bring some of that experience and expertise to this webinar. So you can go ahead and flip forward. So all attendees are coming in on listen only mode. So we encourage you to ask questions in that Q&A or the chat, but we can't hear you, we can't see you. So feel free to ask questions along the way. I will curate those for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So feel free to put those into the chat and into that Q&A section on there. If we aren't able to answer any of your questions, we go to our time limit here. Feel free to email us afterwards, and we will make sure to get back to you. Either email me or my coworker Katelyn, or you can see Keith's email on screen there. We'll make sure to get to it one way or the other. So we wanted to show our calendar events up here on the screen. Our next thing that's coming up is our workshop in Fayette, which we're really excited about. We're going to have Phil Ike from Storyville, and he's going to talk about really how to tell the story of your downtown and your organization. He's renowned throughout the country for doing this. He's done a lot of great work, especially in Michigan on this. We've heard him speak before, and he does a fantastic job. And so we feel like every organization needs to listen to this. And actually, this is a precursor to some work he's going to be doing for us at our state conference as well. As you can see, a lot of the theme throughout our year here is how to tell your story of your downtown and how to tell the story of your organization and its impact. And so we still have registration open for that, and I will pop that actually into the chat, but our registration is still open for that if you want to attend. So as I mentioned, I am joined today by Katelyn Brotherton. She is our strategic partnership coordinator. She will be talking about grants and some best practices that she's learned as she's helped put together grants for our organization, and best practices that she shares with organizations across the state, whether it's presentations or in phone conversations or by emails. She's going to impart a lot of that knowledge onto you today. So I am going to turn it over to Katelyn.
Thank you very much. And again, welcome everyone for joining our webinar. And so I will be discussing, as Ben shared, how to strategize for grants. And as he also shared, I have been doing this for Missouri Main Street. I have been working on our grants and working for Missouri Main Street for almost 10 years. And we have kind of built our grant programming throughout that, how we wanted to utilize grants as our organization, but also then how we can build resources for our communities to help you all also strategize and utilize grants as well. So I'll share some best practices, of course, and what I have learned, and then also we'll go into some resources that you can use from our website, things we have developed, and things we know that would hopefully assist you as you do this research yourself, because as we all know, grants are very time-consuming and can be cumbersome to do as an organization, especially Main Street organizations whenever you're working on so many things. So I first wanted to start off here just with the funding model that we use as Main Street. And many of you have probably seen this. And if you haven't, this is kind of the priority of Main Street organizations. It's a funding model that is an ideal, something to strive towards. And the point of this is that you're diversifying your funding sources. So you're always going towards something else to have multiple revenue streams, and you're not relying too much on one revenue stream to support your organization. And so that can mean, a lot of times for Main Streets, that means not focusing too much on the promotion point of Main Street, not focusing too much on events. But that can also mean not focusing too much on a partnership with your city government and a partnership through that, or also grants, not putting too many eggs in one basket, as it were. So on here, grants fall in two of these categories. They fall in the 30% of the public sector section, as well as 10% for events. And that basically comes down to where the grant comes from, because the majority of grants you'll see do come from the public sector, and we'll talk about that, the different avenues that you can look for grants. But there are federal and state grants that would fall in the public sector, and then those local or foundation grants, that would be more the 10%, more the private, kind of a catch-all section. If you have something that's tied to a specific business or the foundation tied to the business, it's possible that it would work in another section, but it kind of falls in these two sections that I have circled here. So speaking of those state and federal grants, these are the ones that are more cumbersome for people newer to grants to utilize. They take longer to apply for, and they also have a longer reporting time and more forms to use when reporting. So something that kind of, uh, some stats on federal funding just from a 2024 Grant Station report is 33% of their respondents said they received federal funding in 2023. And 40% of those said that they received federal funding on a regular basis. So this is not something that is super widely used, but they are available for you to use if you can kind of get in the rotation of them and be able to match your projects with what they're looking for. I have noted here the 2 CFR 200. So the CFR means the Code of Federal Regulations, and that is a huge document that you will be asked to refer to whenever you are looking into state and federal grants. That has a bunch of the rules and other qualifications outlined, regulations outlined in it. And so you'll refer to the 2 CFR 200. That's something you can start looking into as you're kind of exploring state and federal grants, but also know that it is very dry reading. It is not interesting at all, and it is pretty, it can be difficult to parse through. The down on the fourth bullet point, the start with the NOFA or NOFO, that is Notice of Funding Opportunity or Notice of Funding Availability. And those are sent out and posted when the grant is made available. And that will have all of the information of what they're looking for in this grant opportunity, the priorities that they're looking for, potentially the scoring criteria they're looking for, and it will be more in-depth and tailored to the grant opportunity you're looking for. The CFR is very broad. It's covering the whole spectrum of federal grants, and then state grants also can use it as well. And it is the primary regulation governing grants and cooperative agreements issued by the U.S. government. So that is well, they'll guide you, and then there'll be sections related to specific things. Indirect costs are a big caveat in federal grants. Indirect costs, of course, are the cost of doing business, not associated with a specific grant program, like your rent or your utilities that you have to have in order to be able to sustain a program, but they're not direct program assistance. You are able to negotiate an indirect cost rate with the federal government, but everyone is able to take the indirect cost de minimis rate, which is a standard percentage off the top of your federal grant or just your grant award. And it recently, last October, it raised from 10% to it's now 15%. So this is something that I encourage you, if you're getting into the federal grant system, to be sure you're taking that indirect cost rate, because we know that a lot of these grants don't have the funding in them to be able to fund the kind of background work that is required to do these grants. They are all about pushing those funds out, which is great. Obviously, that's why you're applying for them, but it does cost to do this kind of business. The unique entity identifier is if you're interested in applying for state and federal grants, you will be asked to have a unique entity identifier. It is the number that you will use, and it's just a number to identify you for doing business with the US government. And so they'll be asked for you to put that on your form. It's free to get one, but you just have to go through the process of getting it. I mentioned the NOFO and NOFA. It is listed in the Federal Register whenever the grant comes out, and it can be difficult sometimes to parse through. Sometimes it's very repetitive. You feel like they've said the same thing multiple times. I find it easiest just to print it off and highlight through what's the most important parts. I mentioned earlier the priorities. You want to make sure that you are matching your priorities for your project with the priorities of the application you're trying to submit, and that will be listed in the NOFA. But it will also include a lot of boilerplate language that they have to put in there. And so just be sure that you're reading through it and understanding, how much you can apply for. Obviously, when the application is due, how it is due. It's mostly going to be through the grants.gov system, so an online system to submit the application. But sometimes it is just through sending it to a contact at the department that you're applying for. And speaking of that, be sure you're reaching out to the granting agency contact, especially as federal grants in particular have kind of been up, have kind of had a little bit of issues currently. It is important for you to be reaching out to your granting agency contact to build those relationships so they know what your organization does, why it's so important, who you're reaching and who you're reaching out to. And so you can call them when you have questions, when you potentially have problems, and just build that relationship. Main Street's all about those relationships, and that includes these grants as well. And then I will note, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, I'll even mention it again, but these grants, state and federal, typically are longer grants. They have more questions on the application. They are more time consuming because they have to get more information from you to know what your project is. And there are more requirements for reporting to the government. And so that's something for you to keep in mind as you're considering if this works for your organization. So here's some just general grant tips about when you're applying. The first, I've mentioned it already in this presentation, but grants are deceptively time consuming. I visualize grants kind of in tier systems. So we've already talked about federal grants. Obviously, they're nationwide, the largest applicant pool, and the most time consuming. The state government grants have a little bit smaller applicant pool, but they're still time consuming and have a lot of reporting just when working with the government entities that require a lot of oversight. And then there are foundations and privately held grants. They can still have nationwide applicant pools, so you have to kind of weigh the cost of probability of getting the grant. But in my experience, they have had more straightforward applications, and the reporting has been less time consuming so that you're able to actually do the work and share with them, obviously, your successes, but it is not kind of bogging you down in the system of the things. So the amount of time it takes to submit the application, I always kind of coincide with the amount of time it will take you to report. We're always so excited whenever we get that application, but then we say, well, now we have to do what we said we were going to do. And we want to do that, but it always then takes time to document that, to report it. Typically, it'll be some quarterly reports, but even our federal grants have gotten to more of semi-annual reports just because of the time it takes to do them. And then, so the next one there, don't create projects to qualify grants. My big saying is don't change the plan to find the funding to follow the plan. So don't go chasing grants and making your priorities kind of shoehorn into those grants. Set your priorities and then be able to find grants that fit them. You will prioritize projects a few years out. And so it may be that you want to move one of those projects forward because you have found funding that has come available and won't be available again. But don't try to invent something that you weren't planning to do just to make a grant fit, because that will send you down a rabbit hole that you don't want to go down. And don't forget about matching your funds. A lot of funds will require you to have matching funds, and you have to have a pretty unrestricted source of funding for matching funds for grants. So a lot of times they'll say a 50-50. So you can have, let's say, a $100,000 grant award, and you would have to match that with $100,000 of your own. And obviously that scales. Some grants are 80-20, some are less, some are more. It just depends. A few more tips here. I always say don't use jargon. And what I mean by that is a pretty specific one that affects us all as Main Street. Main Street, I would say, is jargon because I am sure all of you have found, even when you're trying to explain what your organization does, people are like, what is Main Street? We don't have a Main Street. Maybe that street has been renamed. Like they're thinking so literally about Main Street, they don't know what the program is. They don't know what the movement is. And so we want to educate people on what we do. We want to tie it to our terminology, the Main Street approach, but you have to be sure that you are defining that and making them understand what you are meaning by your answers to their questions and not just assuming their knowledge. We are spreading Main Street throughout Missouri, we're spreading Main Street throughout the nation, but there are still a lot of people who aren't fully aware of what we do or the breadth of what we do. And don't assume people know what you're talking about. Don't assume that they will really understand. You may have to say it multiple times a few different ways. The problem with that is you'll often run into character limits or word limits. So be very, be very strategic about how you do that. A good thing about Main Street and using the Main Street approach to apply for grants is how comprehensive our approach is. And so many grants qualify for the projects that you're doing because of how wide-reaching it is. And so be sure that you are not kind of narrowing your focus when you're researching too much. Make sure that you are looking through all 4 points for any possible grant that would help you. Make sure you're also changing kind of the terminology you're using and being creative on how these grants will work with your projects. One thing that we have saw is, you have to use the terms that the granting agency is using, but it doesn't mean that you're changing what your project is. You're just kind of using synonyms for the words. One example I have is we did a application that was small business focused, of course, as Main Street, but the terminology they knew was micro enterprise. And while they're not necessarily exact, swap outs for each other, they understand that, and we understand that they can be used interchangeably in our project. And so we use that as a way to kind of flag their interest in our project. And be sure that you are applying for a lot of grants. It is time consuming, but you have to apply for more than you think you'll need so that you'll be awarded enough. In that same 2024 survey, GrantStation showed that applying for at least 3 grant awards increased the frequency of winning an award. 38% of organizations that submitted 1 to 2 applications had no awards. But if they submitted 3 to 5 applications, 88% received at least one award. And then it went up, 6 to 10 had 96%, and 11 or more had a 97 to 100% success rate. And so you just have to find more than you think you'll need in order to be able to receive enough and actually be awarded enough to cover your project. Something that's also important to note is have a lot of people involved in the grant application. More people, more eyes on the project is important. You'll have a more well-rounded application. So when you find that application and you want to get started on some quick things that you can have ready, or maybe you don't have the application yet that you want to apply for, but you want to help prepare yourself. So this is a list of some things related to your project or even just related to your organization that you can have ready so that you're prepared for any application you find. You'll have to fine tune these for the exact question that you're asked, but you'll be able to just pull this quickly and pop it into an application and spend more time on the specific questions that that application is asking. So you should have your organization's history, short organizational description, you kind of when someone asks what you do, what's an elevator pitch that you just share with them quickly. Your standing partners, who is always there helping you and would be willing to help you implement a grant. And be sure that you have that ready, but then obviously you're going to let them know how they would be involved in that application. The biographies or resumes of people involved in the project, they often want to know your expertise and how long you've been implementing this work so that they know that the project could be successful. And then, of course, as soon as you know you want to apply for a grant for this project, write a quick project description, just so you have something prepped and ready that you can then fine tune, as opposed to having to create something in a short time for the application. Other things to put together are your organizational documents, having your nonprofit status information, your IRS determination letter, your tax ID, your board list, those kinds of things will be asked pretty frequently. And then on the application, I mentioned before using those keywords, knowing their priorities, even if they don't say the priorities in the actual request for the grant, look on their website, see what their organizational priorities are. What is their mission? What words do they use in their mission? Use those as keywords, making sure that you kind of fit your project to match their application, to match their organization. Start with your budget first. This can be kind of hard whenever you're in a time constraint and everyone's trying to work on things together and trying to move it forward. But we have found that starting with your budget first really helps everyone get on the same page, helps you know truly what can be included in the application. You're not writing about something that really the grant even doesn't have the funds for. And you're able to not have to go back and make little tweaks here and there. You're not having to edit a whole bunch of stuff because then the budget gets done and things have to be taken out. If you start with the budget, everyone can get on the same page and move forward with a more clear picture of what the project covers. This does take some time to practice and get your planning and your timing right. We even still have some issues with this just because there's so many moving parts, but really strive for this. And then, like I said, have multiple people assist in the application, have more of that input. As Main Streeters, we know that more collaboration is good. And so having more people give their input on what a project is needed and how to make it better, that strengthens the application. Now we'll talk later about having a champion for moving the application forward. Just like anything, you need someone in charge to be able to push the application through to meet the deadline. But having multiple people assist strengthens your application. And now we talk about reporting. And so I mentioned that reporting is pretty relative to the length of time that application takes. Be sure that you are not spending any money before you're truly awarded the grant, because no costs are allowed prior to the award date. Reporting takes many different forms based on where the award is coming from a federal grant to a foundation grant. They have vastly different requirements for reporting. And so that's where that relationship with the granting agency will really help you be able to ask questions and understand. A lot of organizations will do some sort of training on reporting so that you know what is expected of you. And like I said, a lot of times it'll be on a quarterly or semi-annual basis just to get information to you. Be sure you're setting up a system to track things so you're not having to hunt stuff down on a deadline. You're kind of tracking it throughout. That is what we have found, of course, works best. And then I have a couple examples of trackers that we have used. They're Excel sheets that are kind of overload whenever you're not needing them. I'll share screenshots of them and we can share them too. But it's good to just, of course, track your budget and track where the money is going and how much is left. So this is what these trackers will do. So this is just a snapshot of a much larger tracker that I have used. And these are just dummy numbers that I put in there. But the point of this is that it's a quarterly basis and it shows the total grant amount, and then it has a section for the grantee tracking, so grant your match to the grant, and then below this would be a line that allows you to track your grant award. And I also have found that we have sometimes needed to work with our granting organization to move money from budget areas, and so this allows to track where money has been moved from each line item. And then this was a tracker that we used with EDA. And so it's basically the same principle, but shown a little different. Total budget, cumulative expenditures to date, so how much we had spent and then how much we had remaining on the top. And then on the second row was each of our reports and how much we had spent for each of them, and it all totaled together on the top. So I just show you these to get kind of a visual representation of what you can use for a tracker, but then also for you to know to set something up, you can use these and fine tune them yourselves and just have some way of tracking that information. So now here's some resources that MMSC is able to provide. We really focus our resources on taking the time it takes to do research to find grants off of the shoulders of our communities. And it's not to say that we get all of these grants. It's not that we find them all, but we really try to do as much as we can because that can take a lot of time. Researching and finding grants, you can spend hours and not come up with a grant that really fits your project. And I don't say that to discourage you, but I do say that to let you know the time investment that is required whenever you're prioritizing grants. So the first resource that we provide is our monthly grant resource directory. My coworker, Kathy Wilkerson, puts that together each month, and she does a fantastic job of finding all of these potential Main Street related grants that are available and putting them just in a newsletter that we send out once a month to our subscriber list. We really try to keep it pretty Main Street focused, but knowing how comprehensive Main Street is, it can get pretty broad. We also try to put stuff in there that you can take to your partners and also be a partner on the grant, but it's not necessarily you as a Main Street organization being the lead applicant. So some of them have to be a city as the lead applicant, but they could be a great project for downtown. And so we want you to be in the know. You can take it to the city and encourage that partnership and kind of help guide where those dollars go if your city applies. And so on our website here, that's the screenshot here, we have a grant resources section. You would have to have a login, but you can log in and get access to these as an investor in MMSC. And all of our grant resources are available there in addition to other resources. And so we have the grant resource directory sign up there. And then a new resource we have is we've been putting together a Google Calendar with all of the grant deadlines on it. I know that I really work visually off of a calendar system much better than I do just a list. And so what we have put together here is it will just say when the opportunity opens and when it closes. This is all of the opportunities that we have put in our grant resource directory. And you're able to either to access it on our website and periodically check it. You can take this information and create your own calendar, or you can add this Google Calendar. You can subscribe to it and add it to your own calendar. There will be a lot on here that probably doesn't matter to you. It doesn't work for your projects, but it's a way for you to see kind of what's upcoming and take stock of if that is important to you. Each of these systems, then each of these blue opportunities will have a description of the grant as well as a link to grant information that we have found. So one of them upcoming that I just used here as an example is a close of the USDA Rural Business Development Grant. But you're able to see, kind of quickly read what is available in that grant. And if you're interested in more information, you can go there. It's the same principle that we've been using in the grant resource directory. It's actually the exact same information, but just showing it in a different way in a calendar format so you can all see that and have access to it. We also have a searchable database on our website of these grants that we're working to get updated. So if you have something specific and you want to know what has been available, you can look there and see if it might be upcoming and available again. And then the most recent grant resource directory gets uploaded to the website as well. Periodically, MMSC has grant opportunities available that we award. And so the most consistent one and the one that is upcoming is the Creative Space Activation Grant. The webinar for it is on March 19th at 8:30. And that grant is a placemaking grant. The application, you'll submit the application following the webinar, and then finalists are chosen to present at our Show Me Bash during our conference to be selected by our judges to win a $10,000 placemaking grant. And so periodically we will have those opportunities available. Additionally, we continue to do grant education. And so we have another webinar on grants scheduled for this fall on August 20th to help you prepare for the next cycle of grant availability. Grants really become available and more hefty in the beginning of the year. It kind of starts ramping up in the last quarter of the calendar as kind of the first quarter of the government fiscal year. But then the beginning of the calendar year is really when all of the new opportunities are available. So we'll kind of be breaking that down and discussing that in this August 20th webinar. I wanted to walk through some grant easy wins, just for those that aren't as experienced with grants, or maybe you haven't utilized these. I talk about these a lot in my grant discussions just because we want to be utilizing them, and they're a great way to kind of get your foot in the door of working with grants with your community and with your organization. The first one is the Missouri Arts Council Express Grant. This is accepted on a rolling basis and covers a variety of arts-related projects. Then there's two different ones from the Missouri Humanities Council. The major offered February 1st and August 1st, and the mini due May 1st and November 1st. The major is up to $15,000 and the mini is up to $5,000. Those would each require a match. And they work with anything related to the humanities field. So heritage, cultural, historic preservation projects, anything related to that would match with your Main Street work. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, they have 3 deadlines throughout the year, and they do have a special Missouri-Kansas fund that funds grants from our state specifically. And so they're looking for applications from Missouri and Kansas to match that fund. This would really be for historic preservation education. We apply a lot in October for the next May's Preservation Month, so I encourage you all to do that as well to spread historic preservation education. And then the Walmart Foundation's Community Grant Program, it's accepted on a quarterly basis. It can be up to $5,000. I think typically it's, it can be anywhere from $250 to $5,000. So of course that really runs the gamut. And you can submit 25 applications per year, but once you're approved at one facility, you can apply at that facility again in the fiscal year. So be sure to apply at any Walmart related facility near you. So that includes Sam's Clubs, it includes Walmart neighborhood markets, it includes any of those, and apply to all of them. And just, it has to be something related to the community that store is located in. The stores themselves award these. So just be reaching out and applying to those through their website. And these all get brought up during their deadlines, or like the Walmart one and the Missouri Arts that are on a rolling basis, they're all shared in our grant resource directory as well. So some next steps on kind of grant work that I would encourage you to do. The first is to brainstorm planned or potential projects that need grant support. So set your priorities for projects. Follow your transformation strategies or a strategic plan, your board strategies, or get committee priorities to brainstorm. Look kind of 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 years into the future, so you're aware of your current needs, but also can kind of be looking for grants that you may need to prep or plan for. Get on their cycles and be ready whenever they apply. Some of these grants are pretty involved, but have a short time frame if you're not prepped and ready for them whenever they come available. So be brainstorming, be looking at the calendar, be ready for that. Designate those grant champions to research or lead the application. You need someone to push this through and lead it. This would be a great task for your organization committee in partnership with other committees as projects come up. And investigate who the grant writers are in your community, if they're involved in your organization, or if they can be, or how you can be involved with them. Partner with other organizations to kind of strengthen your grant writing, but also working with them. And see if there's some grant writing assistance in your community, whether it be with the city, your regional planning commission. That's especially important if you're interested in any EDA funding. The Missouri Extension offices, or even libraries. Then establish a system to keep track of grant opportunities. So that can be anything that works for you. That's why we have established the grant resource directory and that calendar, a way for you to pull information and be ready to know whenever something is upcoming. A lot of these grants are very cyclical. They come up at basically the same time every year. So once you know basically whenever it should be available, you can pretty much plan that that's when it'll be available again. So that's why I always say create your own calendar of what works for your priorities, and then be ready to respond to that NOFA whenever it comes open. Set aside time for your own research, and utilize our resources to help you do that. And then evaluate grant availability with your project schedule and your goal. How do grants fit into your strategic plan? It is part of your diversified funding model. It's part of your organization's work as a Main Street organization. And so grants are not the be all end all. It's not meant to consume all of your time. So be strategic in how it fits best with your priorities and with the time and capacity your organization has available now. But know that if you want to take advantage of grants in any real way, in a substantial way, you really do have to set it as a priority to develop a system and create a way to be strategic about it. Okay, and now we will take some questions.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Caitlin. That was a load of information, so appreciate it. So just a couple of questions that we had from the chat that I've already answered. Somebody asked about the URL for the actual resource page, so I put that into the chat. You can access it from there. And then someone asked if the slides will be available. Actually, the entire recording is going to be available, and I'm going to put our YouTube channel into the chat. This has all of our webinars that we've done previously, including awards one that we did earlier this year. That Caitlin mentioned, that creative space one, that'll also be recorded if you're unable to make it. It should pop up here on our YouTube page here within the next couple of days. It takes a little bit of time to process the large file, but it will show up on our YouTube page as soon as we can get it there. So just want to answer those couple of questions there first. But I do have a couple of questions here. So the first one, Caitlin, is I'm guessing this might be a bad year to receive much in federal grants and probably state grants, since many depend on federal money. Are local and private grants sometimes dependent on federal money as well?
It really just depends on where it's coming from. It's possible, but then sometimes they have their own endowments or their own funding sources. So it really just depends on the source. And I would say for, the federal funding, um, it is tricky, but it has always kind of been tricky. It's just different now. And so that's kind of the, diversifying the funding, clarifying with your board, and building those relationships at the federal level will help with that. And as much as, you can help with that. And then, yes, those private and local foundations, sometimes it's based on their own awards, but typically federal funds, they don't like to subgrant funds out. That's one of their big stipulations. So a lot of times it will be they have gotten revenue from another source.
So the next question, which you can correct me if I'm wrong, but is when will the grant calendar be available? It's actually already available on our website. This is a new
Yes.
addition to our website on that grant resources page. And so if you look at that first link that I put into the chat, first it has where you can actually sign up for the grant resource directory, but then below it is the calendar itself, where it has all of the due dates for the grants that are mentioned in the grant resource directory that are populated in that. So that is actually newly available on our website.
Yes.
So
And just like with the grant resource directory, we're doing our best to keep it updated with new information that we find, or just updated with anything that changes with the grants. But obviously encourage you to do your own research. And if you see anything that needs updated there, just let us know, because we're just doing the best to keep that updated as a resource for you all. And it will be updated as we go through with the new grant resource directory information each month.
yep, absolutely. Another question I had is, you talked about matching dollars, but can you talk a little bit about the parameters of that? Like, can you match federal dollars to federal dollars, state to federal dollars? Can you talk just a little bit about kind of the nuances of what that looks like?
Yes. So, like I mentioned, a lot of these grants will require you to have a match. They will specify how much of a match you need. Typically, it's 50-50%, 50% to 50%, or what they call a one-to-one match. So $1 to $1. That is, like I said, most typical. There have been some instances where it's like an 80% award to a 20% match, but that's not as typical in what I have found. I think some of the much larger federal grants get to that point just because they know you can't match to that point. That's why they're doing the grant. But no, to Ben's question, you cannot match federal to federal. You can match state to state or state to federal. You can't match state to state, but keeping in mind you can't match more than you're spending, or you know, you can't have more grants than what you're spending. You have to have enough costs to attribute to both of the grants. So, state can be a match for federal, but you have to be able to show that they're not paying for the same thing, if that makes sense. Their 50% for federal has to cover a different 50% than for state, and it has to be a 50% that matches what they say they want to pay for. So a lot of times, like I mentioned earlier, they don't like to pay for those for staffing. They don't like to pay for that indirect cost. And so that is where sometimes they won't kind of match well.
Can you talk a little bit about not being discouraged or maybe changing your processes when you've been denied on an application? Like, what have you done differently, or is there something as you're reviewing it that you've changed and then applied for it again? Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Mhm. Um, the big thing is, again, those relationships with the granting agency, because that's how you can go back and ask them and always ask them, how was my application scored? Can you give me any feedback? Can you help me to know what I need to do differently next time? Sometimes they're not able to provide you much information. We had a grant that they just ran out of money. So that's something for you to keep in mind. Obviously, each time the grant becomes available, it'll have little tweaks to it. The priorities may be a little different. But sometimes it's literally they ran out of money, so you can just kind of submit it again, but kind of have that conversation, double check with them that there wasn't any red flags that they found or something that just didn't sit well with the reviewers. A lot of times there'll be a team or a panel of reviewers looking over these grants, and so they have kind of their own priorities. They interpret the priorities a different way. And those will be different every time. Like those people will be different, their interpretations will be different. So you can't meet that all the time. You have to stay true to your project and what you need to accomplish. But sharing your project with the granting agency, being in communication with them and getting that feedback as much as you can and building off of that really helps to strengthen your application later down the line.
Um, to Caitlin's point, so like the T-Bumble grant, there's been many times where they've told us we just ran out of money. It wasn't necessarily a bad application. We just ran out of money. We just actually, Caitlin alluded to it. We were in a situation recently. By the time they got to our application, they were just out of money. It was not necessarily anything wrong with it. So like Caitlin said, just go back to them and see, is there something that either pushed it away or did you literally just run out of money? Can I resubmit this in its synced form, updating obviously where necessary.
hmm And I'll add to that too. That same grant that we're talking about, it's actually one I'm working on right now. Um, they had no maximum of grant request amount.
Hmm.
So you could have asked for the moon, but they only have a certain small, relatively, it's a federal grant, a small amount to fund. And so, logically, you want to keep your requests small. Similarly, I know I sat in on a session at National Main Street Conference from the AARP. and they have so much requests. They get so many applications that they can't obviously fund them all, but they fund smaller requests. To keep your requests small helps you get seen there. And it was something like the average was like $11,000, I think, that the request was funded. And so making sure that you are taking advantage of the educational resources on the grants that they provide, any webinars they provide, because they only say so much in the information they publish, but the webinars are very helpful. Obviously, you can ask questions there. And we're trying to provide you with resources and give you access to these people through our webinars, through our conference, and also, of course, National Main Street does that as well.
Mhm. So I had a question. Is it helpful to submit your grant request early on before the deadline?
Sometimes. If you're able, so I know in our experience, and I don't want to harp on this so much, but that is where conversing with the granting agency will help you. When we were submitting for our EDA that we received through back during COVID through the CARES Act fund, they had only so much money, and it was accepted on a rolling basis. So grants that are accepted on a rolling basis, I always find a little bit more difficult because I personally work best on a deadline. And so one thing with EDA, just as an FYI, they're funding on a rolling basis, but they're doing that in anticipation of new money coming in at the start of their fiscal year, October 1st. So they said it's best to get it in around that time prior to October or before October 1st, so that they have the most funding they would have. So that's kind of a deadline whenever none is stated. And then there are a lot of times, like let's say this one that we've been working on, where there is a deadline, but there's not that much funding. So they may take those that have been submitted earlier and kind of timestamp them and review them first. They don't, sometimes they'll say that in the review criteria, saying that you'll that's how they will review them, and they'll just go down the line and award money, and once the money's run out, it's gone. Sometimes they won't state that, but they'll still operate that way. So unfortunately, it's kind of just like you know, you don't really know if that's going to happen, but it is something to consider. On the other hand, you have to weigh that against your capacity to complete the grant, complete it well, have a fully formed idea and application to get it in by the deadline.
Oh, unfortunately, the answer is it depends.
Yeah.
And it really does, grant to grant, how they operate. So it makes it interesting. But I think the big thing, like Caitlin said, is make sure that you feel good about your application before you turn it in, because you don't want a, you know, half done plan and then you get denied because you didn't feel like you had all your eggs in the basket that you were looking for. Couple of last things before we wrap up here. Caitlin mentioned the Walmart grant, and I wanted to mention too that even if you don't have a Walmart in your community, that can be a regional one. I've had a couple of communities that I work with that have actually done a Walmart outside of their community because that was their pull. That was their whole area, their economic pull there that they pull from. And so they were able to get it into another community because they knew that the people from that community that was applying for actually go to that Walmart to shop. And so just because you may not have one doesn't mean that you aren't disqualified from receiving funds from there. And the last thing I wanted to leave with before maybe Caitlin had some parting words and we get to the last couple slides here is really just make this process work for you. I think Caitlin agrees. She has changed her process many times during this as she's figured out what works best for her, whether it's the reporting or actually submitting for the grant itself, how to have that narrative, and what really means a lot to them, to those different organizations that she's applying for. And so take what you've learned here today, but also apply it to yourself and involve the people in the grant writing process that you may not necessarily have either the skills for, or you need someone else to look at that application, just knowing that it's something that's going to be really important for your organization. So again, take what you learned here today and make it work best for yourself, and don't be afraid to change the processes many times over along the way. Okay. So as I mentioned, here's our calendar of events. Our next workshop in person will be in Fayette. And then we have a couple of different webinars coming up on March 18th about empowering effective leadership. And then our Creative Space Activation Grant webinar, as Katelyn mentioned, is a grant that we offer. We're actually using money that we receive in order to actually grant out to our communities. And so how to actually apply for that grant, what we look for as part of a successful application will be all part of that webinar. So be sure to tune into that. And then our next regularly scheduled Mornings on Main webinar will be April, I'm gonna look on here, April 2nd. There we go. Thank you. April 2nd. It'll be on historic preservation. So we're actually going to have 4 different communities that are going to come in and talk about how they have been able to celebrate and encourage historic preservation in their community. They've done 4 very different things, but the purpose of it is to show that use your resources, use the people in your community, in your organization to celebrate, educate on historic preservation and what makes your place unique to you. And they'll show how they've done that either digitally, virtually, or with physical copies of different activities. And so be sure to tune into that. That registration is live on our website to sign up for that. Okay. Any parting words, Katelyn, before we turn this off?
No, I don't think so. I want to say thank you to everyone, and I hope that any of this will help you just strategize for your grants. One thing building off of what Ben had mentioned is, utilizing those people that may not have feel they have grant expertise, but that is definitely something for you to have them read over the application and read it as if someone knows nothing about the project or the organization, because that's really how you strengthen your application as well. So a little parting tidbit, I guess, there.
Yep. Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Katelyn, for doing this webinar today. And like I said, as it is available, we will populate this on our YouTube page as soon as it gets done being downloaded onto our computer after this. So thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic day and maybe get outside because it's finally a little bit warmer. So
Yes.
take care of yourselves, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.